Um, just to say again that to welcome Professor Roger Trigg, who is Professor of Philosophy at Warwick University. He's had a number of extremely important roles during his career: founding chairman of the British Philosophical Association, chairman of the National Committee for Philosophy, founding president of the British Society for the Philosophy of Religion, president of the Mind Association. He's had a particular interest in the interrelationship between science and religion. I can thoroughly recommend The Rationality of Science, which he was talking about earlier, his book on that, The Rationality of Religion, on which he's about to talk to us, and of course Philosophy Matters. Without more ado, I think I'll hand over to Professor Trigg. We will end in good time for dinner this evening, so it won't be a marathon before dinner. We'll have a little bit of it.
Right, well, thank you very much. After that build-up, I might as well talk about my next book as well, which is Religion in Public Life, coming out soon from Oxford. Now, the reason I mention that is actually because it's very relevant to this. Does religious belief need justification? And what do we mean by justification? Well, what we were talking about this morning about science, about verification, for instance, in the context of logical positivism, suggested that what was really thought of as being important in science, what indeed is taken for granted in science, is public acceptance, public verification. We talked a bit about universality. What's true in Washington is true in Beijing. But of course, what's wrapped into that is the notion that this is publicly discussable and arguable and perhaps even able to be settled. That this is a notion of publicity. That science perhaps can dictate the terms of public life. It certainly emerges from public life. Science deals with what's accessible to us all. It doesn't deal with, obviously it's specialized, it's esoteric sometimes, but in principle, it isn't something that is only relevant to some people. If it's universal, if it's talking about the world, it's talking about the world that's common to us all, therefore it's public. Now, is religion like that? If I could go back to Dennis's talk, he made an interesting distinction between science. He's quoting, obviously, what people say. Science is objective, clinical, universal, rational. Clinical is perhaps a special case, but is religion objective? Many people would say it's subjective. Indeed, the list that Dennis gave was subjective, emotional, personal, and unprovable. So not objective, not universal, presumably therefore not rational, not public, but private. And so we get to what one might call the privatization of religion. And just as a moment of background, just think about what is happening in many of our societies at the moment to religion, particularly in Western societies, perhaps because they regard religion as a bit troublesome, because it creates dissension, because there are many religions, and yet there's a vague feeling that perhaps people ought to be free to practice their religion. It's, after all, a basic human right, and there's much talk about human rights nowadays. Nevertheless, let people get on with it as long as they don't cause a nuisance. And therefore, the thing is, it's something you should do in private. People can go to church on Sundays, just as they can go to golf on Sundays, as long as they don't bother other people doing it. And that means as long as it doesn't affect other people's lives in any way. Now, of course, there's a serious aspect of that. They don't want laws about abortion dictated by people who with particular religious views, say. But it affects everything. Very simple example. I was at a conference in Toronto a few years back. My hotel, I was on the 28th floor, and we were looking down on the City Hall in Toronto, a rather modern building. And they were putting up a Christmas tree, this being just the beginning of the Christmas season, or perhaps the beginning of the shopping season might be a better way of putting it. But there was a Christmas tree going up. It looked like a Christmas tree. It was being put up at the right time. Even for Advent, if one bothered about such things. And certainly one thought, yes, there's a Christmas tree. But of course this is Canada, and Canada is influenced by the United States. Canada is very conscious of being a pluralist, multicultural society, etc., etc. And it was decreed from City Hall that this was not in fact a Christmas tree, it was a holiday tree. And so it looked like a Christmas tree, I mean it smelled like a Christmas tree, but it was a holiday tree. And all hell broke loose in the local media because people objected to this. Eventually, actually, in the course of a day or so, this had to be retracted, that a city official had announced that it was a holiday tree. But what actually in the end happened was that the mayor of Toronto said, no, indeed, it is a Christmas tree. And he said, just because we respect other people's traditions doesn't mean we can't practice our own, which is a fair point. But just think how often that kind of thing is being replicated in our society. No Bibles by hospital beds because it might offend the Muslim, etc., etc. I mean, send a Christmas card saying season's greetings. Don't mention Christmas for anybody at all. And the excuse is always it will offend people of other religions. It doesn't, in fact. I find that people of other religions are very sympathetic to people who want to practice their own. The people who are most understanding of other religions are the people who are most committed to their own, in my experience. No, the people who object to this are the people who don't like religion at all and regard this as a wonderful way of clearing it out of society. And so actually what they want is a society purged of religion because they regard religion as something, well, perhaps to be tolerated in a private way. But why do they do this? Because what they're really saying is, well, science is rational, but religion isn't. I think actually, to go back to the last talk, scientism is probably really influencing our society more than the postmodernism that I'll talk about tomorrow. So still there's the idea that public standards of argument are set by science. That in science, but perhaps it's not altogether disreputable, in science it's thought perhaps we might find agreement. In religion, it seems all we do is foment disagreement, and there seems no end to it. And people are afraid of religion, and they think, well, if it can be sanitized by being privatized, let's do that. And this is affecting the whole approach to law and to public life. But its roots, I think, lie very deep in philosophical attitudes about the status of faith, the status of reason, and really the way in which, as I've said this morning, science is thought to be setting the standards. So again, think that science is objective, but then religion is, because it's subjective, it's something that each person must answer to themselves for, but they can't argue about it. If science, therefore, is to be universal, well, religion certainly isn't. Religion is going to make claims that are true for its adherents. There are different religions, no end to religions. Therefore, it's thought that religion can't make claims of universal significance. And, of course, as I've said, this means the death of any idea of rationality in religion. Now, unfortunately, I think some people on the religious side rather help this attitude along. And I suppose the whole thing can be summarized by the question of what is the relationship between faith and reason, a very venerable topic, of course. But just think of the way in which this is being operated now, because if you put reason and rationality on the objective scientific side, then that means that the subjective side, the religious side, is the side of faith, but faith is therefore not rational, and doesn't take much sleight of hand by people such as Dawkins to suddenly say it's irrational. No sensible person should, in fact, hold a religion. I wrote a book once called Reason and Commitment. The genesis of that was actually that one day Mormons came knocking at my door, and I rather foolishly invited them in. And they so angered me and at the same time fascinated me, because we had an argument and I got nowhere, but neither did they. And I thought in the end, how is it that people can be so fervent in their beliefs and yet, from my point of view, so wrong? In other words, commitment isn't enough. It should surely be rationally based. And I've always, since then, believed that, in fact, religious commitment has to have a rational grounding. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, we all agree, and I think this is one of the problems, because in science, when we talk about universality, there's also the idea that actually people are going to agree or will agree. It was Peirce, the American pragmatist, who really rather defined reality in terms of ultimate agreement by scientists. Now, it was a kind of scientific millennium that probably will never arrive, but nevertheless the idea was that in principle one day science will produce that kind of agreement. And of course, if you define reality in terms of agreement, well, you might think that science can deal with reality, but I don't think you're going to have much chance with religion, because the fact of disagreement in religion, both within religion and between religions, is obvious. And one of the great problems, of course, is that there are set scientific procedures for dealing with disagreement. People in laboratories know how they're to set about dealing with particular issues, what might settle them, what kind of data might be relevant. What is the equivalent procedure in religion? And it all too often looks as if there are no settled procedures, and so therefore people from the science side can say it must be irrational, there's just no way of proceeding. So reason becomes the province of science, and faith is made to appear more and more subjective. And then religion is squeezed out of public life. And this links up then with great issues even to do with the separation of church and state. Well, all right, one can argue about that, but that very quickly becomes the separation of religion and society, which I think is a much more problematic idea. But of course, if religion is not the kind of thing that can appeal to a publicly accessible reason, it has to be privatized. There is no way it can have a public role. There is nothing that people can have in common in order to talk about it. So I think actually it's very important to realize that religion ought to, and indeed does, have a rational grounding. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to convince everybody, or it doesn't mean that all religious believers are right. Because what I'm really saying here is that just because reason is at stake doesn't follow that we're the reasonable people, that I'm rational and you're not. But there are standards of reason at work here. I get very concerned about, as I said, that some people on the religious side actually help the separation of faith and reason by appealing to faith rather than reason. I remember once hearing of an American who was visiting Washington, and she didn't want to go into an exhibition about evolution because it might shake her faith. Now, I find that kind of thing worrying, because it's almost as if you can't face up to the real world in case it might shake your own beliefs. But there's something very wrong with a belief that can't face the complete truth about everything. Because if you actually believe your religion is true, it will always cohere with what we know about the rest of the world. Dennis this morning mentioned coherence, and that is, of course, a very good test of truth, but it is only a test, and it's far from being a sufficient one. But certainly coherence, internal coherence, and also coherence with the rest of our knowledge is enormously important. And if you once put religion in a separate compartment and say, well, now that's my compartment for religion, and I'll shut my mind to all the rest of the things that are going on outside, in case, somehow or other it disturbs my faith, there's something very wrong going on. It should all cohere. But if I can just say as an addendum, coherence is an important test. Incoherent beliefs aren't likely to be true, but coherence is in no sense a guarantee of truth, and you can have lots of alternative coherent religions, each internally coherent, but that doesn't help you to know what's true. So coherence, I mean, this is, from a philosophical point of view, this is one of the objections to what's called the coherence theory of truth. I mean, coherence is defining truth. There are different sets of coherent statements. And so coherence, yes, is a test, but not the only one. But our faith should cohere with the rest of our knowledge. That's the point. And faith never occurs in a vacuum. Sometimes, there was no Beatles song, All You Need Is Love, and sometimes I feel people are saying all you need is faith. And it's all very well, but I want to say, well, yes, but what? Faith in what? Faith is meaningless until you say what you have faith in. All I need is a belief, but yes, but believing in what? So faith is always faith in something. Faith always has an object of belief. Unfortunately, that doesn't guarantee the object is there. You can have a faith in a non-existent thing. That's certainly true. But so it is faith directed at something. If you just stress faith and don't emphasize what it's in, what the object of it is, the conclusion is that in the end you have faith in nothing. And that's not much use. It becomes, therefore, a fact about us and about the direction of our life, what we think important, not something about what we're saying about the world. And indeed, of course, the more you emphasize the subjectivity of faith, the more it becomes an interesting fact about individuals, and the less it becomes a statement about the world. But proper religious faith isn't just about the commitment of an individual, it's saying what that individual is committed to. And once you start specifying that, once you say what you have faith in, of course, reason enters into it. If I say, well, I believe in God, I have faith in God, what do I mean by God? What am I saying? And I have to start specifying that. And that must involve reason. It's no good just saying, oh, I don't have anything to do with reason. I have faith in, because anything that you specify, you must rationally justify. I can have total faith in my doctor, but if he died yesterday, even if I didn't know it, that's not much use. I can have total faith that the bridge will carry me across the river, but if it was blown up half an hour ago, again, it's not going to be much use. So I have to, in fact, not only have faith, which can be real enough, I mean, people can have real faith in stupid things, but the faith to be justified must be about something that is actually as I think it is. And again, then, therefore, reason enters in. So faith, therefore, is not just a decision to live a certain kind of life. You'll notice that in the philosophy of religion, those of you who read much about it, there is a great tendency to backtrack very often to the person, not what the faith is in. It's the kind of life you live. I mean, this was exemplified once by writings of a philosopher called Braithwaite from Cambridge, who said, well, religious belief, religious faith is just a decision to live a certain kind of life with certain kinds of stories in your mind. The Christian will think nice things about Jesus' stories, and Muslim will think about other ones. But the important thing is, what kind of life are you living? It's a decision to live in a particular way. And I think pragmatist philosophy rather led to that. I mean, I mentioned this morning the question, what difference does it make to your life? You see, if you talk about faith and just say, well, what difference does it make to someone's life, you're going to look at how they act, how they behave, the way of life they live, not again what they're believing in. And I think in a way that was what the later Wittgenstein thought. He mentioned religious belief in some lectures, and he was looking at it very much as a decision to live a certain kind of life. He said, what difference does it make to people's lives, rather than being a set of metaphysical propositions. Now, of course, faith, if it's real faith, makes a difference to people's lives, but it's also something that carries with it belief in certain things being the case. In other words, it does carry with it certain metaphysical claims, because usually religious faith isn't just talking about the physical world, it's talking about something that lies purportedly beyond the physical world. And therefore, it's making claims that, of course, are beyond the reach of science, and that's the rub. But nevertheless, just because they're beyond the reach of science doesn't mean they're irrational, unless we get trapped back into the scientism that says that rationality is defined by science. Well, I mentioned realism this morning in connection with science, in fact, and I mentioned it in terms of metaphysical realism, that there is a reality independent of us. I think it's quite important, actually, to keep metaphysics, the theory of what there is, apart from epistemology, how we get to know it. Probably one thing we might discuss tonight, if you're interested, is just whether the notion of critical realism, with which I'm very sympathetic, with what the ideas behind it, nevertheless somehow manages both to be saying something metaphysical and epistemological at the same time, so it's actually mixing up two different things. I think that metaphysics and epistemology ought to be kept separate. The metaphysics grounds the epistemology. Reality grounds the possibility of our knowledge. But having talked about realism, metaphysical realism in connection with science, I'd also want to emphasize its role in connection with religion. I make no apology, therefore, for being a metaphysical realist right the way across the board, about religion as well as about science. And perhaps I should offer a caveat. A metaphysical realist believes that reality is as it is, independent of our beliefs about it. Now, if I'm being a metaphysical realist about God, I'm saying that the reality of God is not a projection of our beliefs. Now, I think there are plenty of people in the last 200 years who've actually wanted to say that belief in God or something like that is a projection. From Feuerbach onwards, Freud, a lot of people who wanted to say that religious belief is perfectly real but explicable in terms of something that's going on in human beings. We're projecting our wishes, our beliefs in some sense onto a wider scheme of things. Now, metaphysical realists are saying, of course, that's very far from the truth, that reality is as it is, whatever we think, whatever we want it to be. We may wish there to be a God and there is a God. We may wish there to be a God and there isn't. Our wishes are, from the point of view of ontology, strictly irrelevant. But if I say that the reality of God is independent of our understanding of it, I think that what I'm also saying, therefore, is that the assertion of atheism is itself something that is perfectly conceivable under a metaphysical realist scheme. The world may be such that there is no God, and that's the truth about the world, independent of the way we think about it. We can be theists and be wrong. And indeed, that's the point about metaphysical realism. It's saying that our beliefs about reality have to be measured against reality, and sometimes can be found wanting. As I've said, this can produce questions about skepticism, but we'll put those on one side for a moment. Anything else, anything that collapses reality into belief, can have the most unfortunate consequences, which we see very often in religion today, that actually religion stops being about God and starts becoming something to do with the way humans regard things, the way they view their lives. A lot of writings in philosophy of religion and about religion very often are reducing religion to something else. They may try and make out it's all very important, but in the end, the religious claims about God aren't really about God, they're something else. They're about our decisions to live in a particular way. And I would want to say that actually, from a metaphysical realist point of view, claims about God, therefore, have to be measured against reality. And that means, therefore, that for the theist as for the atheist, there's no guarantee that just because they believe something very strongly that it's true. And this is very relevant to questions about religious faith, because unfortunately, the world is full of people who are certain about things and wrong. And so even tremendous certainty, tremendous assurance I think, can't guarantee the truth of something. And that does therefore mean that reason enters into it, just because I'm absolutely certain. Now, I say this with some reluctance because people can have mystical experiences and very strong religious experiences that they feel more sure than anything else that they've undergone in their lives. And I don't want to underestimate that, but one still has to accept the fact that the certainty is still perhaps of a psychological kind, and one has to spell out a bit more the context of what's going on. Reason still has a role to play. Without a realist view of religion, we then are back to, as I've said in the case of science, we're back to the path to nihilism. Now, one thing that I think is particularly difficult in this kind of area, and particularly if you look at science and the contrast between religion and science, it shows the difficulties. There aren't many sciences. I had a vice-chancellor a few years ago in Warwick who got very contemptuous of philosophy because he says in science we don't have continental science and Anglo-American science. It's just science. I mean, he was making a hit at discussions in our philosophy department about continental philosophy and analytic philosophy and so on. But of course, the same problem arises with religion because there isn't in science a kind of one kind of science for Westerners, another kind of science elsewhere, as I've reiterated again and again today. But, of course, once you look at religion, there isn't one religion for the world. There are lots of different religions, and some of them rather disreputable ones too. I think one problem about discussing religion is that very often we stick to what I would call the respectable religions. I suppose another way of putting it would be the ones that have been thought out from an intellectual point of view, the higher religions, or the world religions. But nevertheless, it's a selective group of religions. It's not some of the nastier forms of religion which involve human sacrifice, or the more primitive forms of religion that just can't cope with any form of science, or the Satanism, for instance. Or, I mean, you can think of all kinds of religions that, in fact, and indeed, some people are not above making up religions. I came across a case, this is a real case, it came to the Federal Appeals Court in America in the 1970s. A group of prisoners claimed that it was their religion in prison, in a federal prison in the US, that they should be given sherry and steak at 5 o'clock on Friday evenings. Now, I mean, I would have thought any sane person would see that they were trying something on there. But I mean, the federal court said, oh yes, it's a religion, separation of church and state, we have to respect all religion. Yes, and yes, that's a religion.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand. They should be given sherry
and steak.
Yeah, which is...
It was their religion. I mean, I suppose, you might say, well, for Christians it's important that they have a sacrament of bread and wine. Well, they say that their sacrament on Friday nights is sherry and steak to be provided by the prison authorities.
Everything an alcoholic drink. I think sherry's not...
You know, perhaps you're not familiar with the term sherry, but it's a Spanish wine.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it was Harvey's Bristol Cream, I think, actually. I mean, they went into great detail about this, about what it should be. I cannot credit, actually, that a serious court would take that seriously. But actually, in the United States now, they're very reluctant to rule anything out as a religion that people claim is a religion, as long as they're sincerely claiming it. And then, well, the question is, what's sincere? I would have thought in that context that wasn't. It must be respected. And then they get into terrible problems about what happens when religion comes up against the criminal law, or that drug taking is part of the ceremonies of the religion. They get up against problems with Native Americans and so on. Anyway, the whole point is that there are lots of different religions, and if people can start defining it for themselves, and you say we must respect all religions, rationality is broken down completely. So I think that from the point of view of society, it's rather important that they do not think that religion is a reason-free area. There are plenty of religions I would want to criticize. I'm not going to say that it's a prima facie defense of human sacrifice, that it was part of a religious ceremony. It's just human sacrifice and that's it. It's murder. And if you take that line, you're beginning to criticize religion in one way or another. But I think that, therefore, religion and rationality can't be separated and shouldn't be separated. But nevertheless, we have this business about the existence of many religions. Many of them are incompatible with each other. Well, indeed, they all contradict each other to some extent. Even the ones that are very close to each other. The issue of the divinity of Christ, for instance, would obviously be a big issue. So what do you do when you're faced with this? Because you feel, well, we're not going to have any notion of a settled procedure. If you have strong disagreement among scientists, there's a procedure in principle for actually settling this. I think actually probably it's a mistake to emphasize too much how much scientists do agree. There can be pretty bitter disputes and long-running disputes between scientists. Indeed, it was Thomas Kuhn who said that actually some of them would only be resolved when some of the scientists die, and so some of the people are just out of the picture. So it's, going to be, I think, not an easy matter even in science. People do disagree, and you're not only always going to convince people, because people aren't always rational, even when they're, there's still people who presumably believe in a flat earth. There are flat earth societies and so on. Never actually met somebody like that, but I'm willing to accept that perhaps there is somebody like that. People can deny what is obviously true. But it seems to be more obvious in religion than in science, even though disagreement, of course, is part of the lifeblood of science. If all science agreed, there wouldn't be any progress anyway. There wouldn't be any kind of testing of new theories. There wouldn't be any competition, which is one reason, again, as a parenthesis, why I think science hasn't done very well in totalitarian societies where that kind of freedom for testing and discussion doesn't take place. So you can, I think, overdo the unanimity that you in fact achieve in science, but nevertheless it's the ideal. Is it the ideal in religion? Well, I don't think perhaps we want a religion of the lowest common denominator, that a bit of this and a bit of that. But you have lots of different religions, and what, in fact, is the solution? Now, I haven't got a quick solution, but I do think that we ought to be willing to use our reason, that each of those religions are making claims to truth, and those claims should be tested. For instance, I actually haven't on principle read the Da Vinci Code, but I understand what's in it, and I would have thought it's all obvious nonsense. But if it were true, it would begin to pose a lot of questions about the belief of the historic beliefs of the church, and the whole thing begins to shift. And if there never was a person called Christ, there couldn't be Christianity. So there are all kinds of things being stated in Christianity, claims to historical truth, which could be disproved. So that's a start, even apart from the more metaphysical issues about God. The same in other religions, very often, that there are historical claims being made that we can discuss. Now, we're not necessarily all going to agree, and sometimes we can respect our divergences while seeing that people have reasons for believing what they do, even if we don't believe that they're good ones. But as I've said, not all religion is going to be like that. Some religions, I think all rational people would say, should be ruled out. Some religions look totally unacceptable. So reason can get a grip, even in the field of in the field of religion. But I don't think that we should expect an easy agreement. Science progresses, as I've said, through testing alternative theories and through disagreement. And on the whole, the disagreements, we think, will be resolved. And perhaps that isn't going to happen in religion. It may be, one reason is that religion is dealing with intrinsically more complicated issues. That may seem a paradoxical thing to say, but I mean, they are dealing with things that are almost beyond our grasp. Now, therefore, that's one reason, obviously, why people who believe in science would say, well, so much the worse for religion, let's not, in fact, bother about it. But I don't think that we should give up on reason. So I think that what I'm really saying here is that, as in science, the same philosophical position ought to hold that reality, physical reality in case of science, and other purported realities, transcendent reality of one kind or another, spiritual, non-material reality perhaps, is claimed in religion. And what it's like differs between different religions. One approach is the approach taken by the philosopher of religion John Hick, who rather wants to empty out really all of the particular claims of religion and say, well, there is a reality that all religions are aiming at, and he rather tends to put it as it with a capital R, but like Kant's things in themselves, his noumenon, they're things we can't really reach, and all religions are attempts to reach this in their own way, and they all fail. And I'm not very happy with that. I mean, it's a way of trying to bring together religions as being all shown to be on the same path, but I think it's virtually very difficult to remain committed to a religion if you're that aware of its deficiencies, if you think that it's actually wrong, if actually Jesus is not the Son of God. And of course John Hick was one of those who wanted to say the incarnation is, in the strictest sense of the term, a myth, that Jesus wasn't actually the Son of God. But if you really believe that, then how can you really be a full-blooded Christian? If in other religions you really believe that actually your beliefs aren't saying what's true, but they're only ways of characterizing a reality that's actually beyond your reach and is actually very different, perhaps, so much so that you can't characterize it at all, then does that give you any justification for going on being committed? So I'm not very happy about trying to get some kind of nice agreement or toleration between all religions by trying to empty them all of specific content. I think that there are real divergences, differences in claims that we can't resolve. Now, of course, that's the problem, because again, the person who believes in scientism will say, well, that just proves my point, that rationality isn't getting a grip if you think you can't resolve it. And but I would want to say that I think that the notion of rationality shouldn't be confused with the ability to settle arguments. That and just because we're not particularly successful in getting to an agreement doesn't mean that A, there isn't something to agree about, and B, that different positions aren't being reasonably put forward. Of course, if we haven't got full information, we're always going to fall short, and there always is going to be room for disagreement. And I think in this kind of area, obviously, to some extent, we are all operating to some extent in the dark. Now, I mean, I don't want to belittle issues about revelation or anything like that, but I think anybody would realize that if there is a God, God is by definition transcendent, beyond us, above us, and we can never properly, with our finite minds, grasp a lot about God's nature. So we can't answer some of these questions, and that's one of the problems. But what the particular thing I'm trying to emphasize is that nevertheless different religions are claiming truth. And if the conclusion is because they disagree with each other that some of them are false, I'm quite willing to accept that. And if I belong to one religion, obviously I would think that the others are false. But I would also recognize that the members of other religions think the same about mine. So there's still some room for respect and mutual understanding there. But the great danger, of course, in all this is that it can collapse into relativism and to an easy thought that, oh, well, it's true for you, but it isn't true for me. And I want to talk about that kind of thing tomorrow. The important thing to keep a grip on is the idea that there is this idea of one world, one reality that we all are trying to have access to. Now, anti-realist views about religion have become very widespread in recent years, and by anti-realist views, I mean the kind of views that try to say actually the true character of religion isn't to be found in these metaphysical claims. Now, I've already mentioned the later Wittgenstein as one source of these views. Continental philosophy leading to postmodernism is another source, and again I'll talk about postmodernism tomorrow. Let me just talk about Wittgenstein again for a moment and his followers, because what they've been trying to say is that there is no metaphysical grounding for religion, that religion isn't the kind of thing that can be justified. Again, we're back to the notion of language game that I mentioned this morning, because that is actually explicitly said by a lot of these thinkers, that in fact religion is a language game. So you're either in it and you play the rules, or you're outside it and probably don't really understand what's going on. So you have to be a participant properly to understand it. You can't justify it. There is no ground to stand on which it can be justified. And this comes back to the question about whether religious belief needs justification. I think if faith isn't free-floating and isn't ultimately arbitrary and subjective, it does need a justification. It needs to be grounded in a reality that's separate from and beyond us all. Now, anti-realism is taking the opposite track, and it's really trying to say, no, what religion is, its true nature, has got nothing to do with these metaphysical claims trying to get a grip on something which is beyond us. It's much more to do with a way of life. It's much more to do with our practices. But what justifies our practices? And go back to the issue of commitment. It's all very well being committed, but why? What reason is there for being committed? If I can't give a reason to other people, I can't have a reason myself. It's no good just being committed. But, I mean, why do I do it? Why do I go on doing it? Another prominent strain of anti-realism is that exemplified by Don Cupid, who used to be down the road in Emmanuel College. And again, he, I think, was trying to say that religion is not making metaphysical claims. It isn't making claims about truth. It isn't making claims that perhaps apply to everybody, because, of course, one consequence of a form of anti-realism might be that these claims are valid for those who hold them. It can very easily tip over into relativism, but there isn't, you've lost the grip on universality. And I think that as we finish talking about universality this morning, perhaps I can just go on to talk about that a little bit in connection with religion, because I do firmly believe that religion is making claims of universal applicability. In other words, and this is why it's so disastrous to find that religion is privatized. In other words, it's a matter of subjective choice, because if religion is making proper claims, they're claims that are valid for all of society and for all of the people in it. I'm not saying one should necessarily impose one's views, that's a political question, but that they should be listened to because they have applicability is certainly, I think, undoubtedly the case. So if you push anti-realism and push the idea that metaphysics is, and I think the shadow of positivism is still there even in this, that because metaphysics is regarded as somehow a useless subject, a non-subject. It's talking about something beyond our reach. The very notion of the transcendent is in effect, what anti-realism is saying, is a non-notion, because we're conceiving something that's inconceivable. We're reaching out to something that's inaccessible. And how we do that in religion, how in fact we can talk about a God beyond us is another issue, a big issue, and one of the questions that has to be answered. Indeed, I suppose one of the great problems about the realist kind of view I'm putting forward is that if you separate reality and knowledge, you have to say how it is that knowledge is possible, and what in fact enables the bridge to be made between, in fact, a reality that's wholly other and us. I suppose that's a philosophical justification for a revelation, actually, that unless God comes down to our level, if we believe in God, that there is no way that we will understand about God, or unless somehow we have a prior understanding of God in some sense. But either way, somehow it has to come from within us, or God has to come to us. We can't talk about something that's totally beyond our reach. One of the great problems about anti-realism, I think, is actually that it's not true to the nature of religion. Because although I'm talking philosophically, actually it's a bit like saying, scientists are actually critical realists, even whether they realize it or not. All religious believers are realists. Almost all, unless they've done too much philosophy. But religious believers of any religion are realists. They may, in addition, not just think there is a reality, they may think they know it, they perhaps may be too confident that they know it. But religion is based on the idea that there is a reality, and our knowledge of the reality matters, and it affects our lives. It's something that's so important that it should affect everything that we think and do. Because it isn't just an interesting side issue. It's not like thinking, that pillar box is red, how interesting. If there is a God, it isn't a fact about the world. This is sometimes the kind of thing that Wittgensteinians throw up, that it isn't just a fact about the world. Well, it isn't a fact that can leave us cold, but that doesn't mean it isn't a fact. If God created us, that's a point that's so important that it must affect the way we view the world, that it affects our vision of the kind of world we're living in, and that must affect the way we act in the world and towards the physical world. It's therefore something that isn't just an interesting byproduct. It's not just one fact amongst others. Sometimes, again, I've heard these kind of philosophers saying, well, you shouldn't believe that God is objective because, and then they slide over to saying God isn't an object. Well, God isn't an object like this or a table or something like that. But that doesn't mean that God isn't there. And it doesn't mean that God is just one object amongst others that we can discount. So nothing that I'm saying about the reality of God is somehow saying that it's just an interesting fact. I suppose what I am saying is that the God of the philosophers is actually very important as the God of God of religion. I don't go along with this idea that somehow the God of the Old and New Testaments is somehow different from the God of the philosophers. Perhaps some philosophers can be too bloodless in talking about God and make it an intellectual puzzle, but the God of the philosophers is the God that we reason about, but it's the God that we try to understand. And indeed, as John Locke recognized, if you're talking about revelation, unless you have some idea of who or what is being revealed, and unless you can discern probably what is a revelation genuinely from what isn't, in other words, unless you're using your reason in the first place, you can't get to grips with revelation. Otherwise, any sudden blinding idea will think, there are plenty of people around who think that. If they suddenly get an idea, they think that's God giving it to me. I've come across preachers like that who say, I never prepare a sermon, I go up and God inspires me, and you can tell it too. I prefer preachers who use their reason on the ground, and this I think is important, on the ground that reason itself is God-given. It isn't something that goes against God. And this goes back again to reason being the candle of the Lord, of course, because I think one of the things that makes people want to separate out faith and reason is somehow they're going along with the idea of reason as being something that's already the monopoly of science, that's already shut out God, that's already a human activity. But true rationality shouldn't be something that is as narrow as that. It shouldn't be of its nature something that is perhaps already human, hubristic, opposed to God, why can't true rationality itself, in a small way, be reflecting the reason, the logos of God? After all, if we really believe in a God of reason, and I think that anybody, particularly who's interested in science, would think that if they believe in God, they believe that God is the source of reason and truth, then we shouldn't be afraid of rationality and we shouldn't be afraid of searching for truth, because there lies God. And that doesn't mean that our first ideas are going to be right, and it doesn't mean we sometimes shouldn't be very careful about what we're thinking. And if we suddenly come up with an idea that seems to go against all religious views, that might be a way reason for testing it and looking at it. But reason is not of its nature irreligious. Reason, in fact, might be itself as much the heart of religion as so-called faith. Right, I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much indeed, Roger. Now, what we're going to do is spend a quarter of an hour on questions, and then I would encourage you to write more down on the sheets of the panel this evening. So, who'd like to start?
Thanks so much for the very articulate talk. I would just like to add a comment and testify to support your
Right.
first observation. You said it's not the existence of Christian, images or Bibles which offends other faiths. Actually, it's the non-existence of them, maybe. And I agree, yes. And as a Muslim myself, I'm not offended by the Christian Europe. I'm offended by the post-Christian Europe,
Yes.
which says that faith is a illusion and it should go away. And I've seen this in many instances. Like many people I know in the Islamic world from my country in Turkey, they go to the United States, they see a dollar bill and in God we trust. And anything about Jesus, they say, oh, these people are religious, that's good. And what offends them is just the materialistic, aggressive secularism, which saying that, religions, all of them are, just myths and we should get rid of them.
Yes,
so that's very important. And
I was in a committee the other day, and one of the committee members said, well, this is a Christian country, we should expect such and such. And I thought, yes, we should expect it, but you won't get it. And the speaker was a Muslim. And she was fully expecting that Christians ought to be behaving in a particular way. But there'd be plenty of people who would say, oh, we mustn't behave like that, it will offend X, Y, and Z. But of course what they're really saying is, we don't want religion. That's the thing.
thank you.
Yes. Dave wants to ask a question.
You said that you couldn't accept a religion that could offer a human sacrifice, and we'd be inclined to agree. But then could you comment on Abraham's offering of Isaac, and God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son?
Yes. I was actually thinking of real modern instances of perhaps children in connection with even African religions, so there have been suggestions of ritual slaughter even in this country. So it is a real issue that it can, and I find it abhorrent. Abraham and Isaac, that's a tough one. I cannot believe that God would have willed a child to be sacrificed. I think, in a way I would think, putting it very simply, that that's a record of people's growing understanding of the nature of God, rather than a report of what God actually did. Now, when you're talking about the human the sacrifice of Jesus, and of course, all of that is imagery that's being used in the context of Old Testament sacrifices and so on, sacrifices at the temple. So it is imagery which is... in a sense, though, the whole point about the crucifixion is that it was a terrible thing. It was the result of human sin. Even though you might say, yes, well, it was God's will, etc., it was still something that ought not to have happened. It wasn't something that's a good thing that's part of our religion. And I always think the important thing about Christianity really is that the real symbol is the empty cross, not the suffering of Christ, but Christ in glory, the fact that the cross is not actually still claiming him. I mean, the cross is, well, we're going to get in very deep theological water, but I think, the whole question of sacrifice, atonement, and so on is a very big issue. But obviously, in the end, it isn't justifying sacrifice. I mean, otherwise, we wouldn't be thinking, that it was a terrible effect of sin.
I mean, there are all sorts of roads that could go down.
Yes.
It could take us all night.
Well,
of course,
not necessarily roads that are
because it's God, giving Himself.
Yeah. Oh, I know. Well, I mean, it's not the kind of theology perhaps we can deal with in 5 minutes.
It is a problem, but I think Ellen may want to make a
yes.
This isn't the issue of human sacrifice. An important part of your argument was that in the context of science, there is a mode of justification of science, and there is a mode of justification of that mode of justification. There is a meta level whereby if in fact two scientists disagree, there's not only a means of they have at least available to them a means of settling the discussion, but they have a means of justifying that way of settling the discussion. I didn't catch you doing anything like that in the context of religion. I mean, supposing you have two people who disagree very strongly religiously, they represent different religious views, and you tell them there must be a mode of justification that you have here, and it turns out that each of them has a completely different mode of justification. How do you handle that kind of disagreement?
Yes, but you see, of its nature, it's very difficult probably to handle it here. Now, I mean, with science, we're dealing with things that probably are accessible. I'm afraid I'm rather inclined to go along with St. Paul and say, well, now we see through a glass darkly, then face to face. I mean, that one day, not in this life perhaps, it will be resolved, but we perhaps can't resolve it at the moment altogether. I mean, that doesn't mean we can't rule out some things, but there are other things that may not be possible to actually settle. So but that doesn't mean there isn't a reality which one day will prove one side right or the other wrong.
No, of course not, but you have to put that off until the someday.
Well, ultimately, perhaps we might. Yes.
So that, in that sense, the mode of I mean, I'm not criticizing this. I'm just saying that the mode of justification here is really much weaker.
Well, this is the problem, of course.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, in other words, we can sometimes, this is the kind of thing that some American philosophers of religion say, that of course we can be justified, but not be able to give a justification.
Yeah.
And the ability to give a justification sometimes is very much less. I mean, this is why the problems arise, because we're dealing with issues that we haven't entirely got a handle on here and now.
But you are, I mean, it was important in the earlier part of your talk to say that we're appealing to reason here.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, but the appeal to reason is certainly not going to be very decisive between two people who disagree fundamentally about religion. We're talking to a Christian and a Muslim, for example. The idea of deciding between them in terms of reason raises a lot of difficulties, I think. I mean, to call that a mode of justification, one has to really qualify the notion of justification there very strongly. I mean,
yes.
This is not I'm not really disagreeing with you. I'm just pointing out that what we have here is an extreme. I don't want to fall, I don't want to fall back on a simple waving of the flag of faith and say it's all a matter of faith.
No, or fall into relativism, which would be very easy.
Won't do.
Yes.
But at the same time, the notion of reason here is really very sticky.
Yes, I mean, there are limits. I mean, if Jesus hadn't existed, if Muhammad hadn't, I think some of the claims are historical, so they are open to reason. I mean, after all, some people in religion don't like that. I mean, they resist that. The idea that reason could put to the test their faith. I mean, they find that very repugnant.
Yes.
And that is, I think, a view that I would be arguing against, actually, that I think that actually one has to be willing to accept that. Because actually a faith that can't be tested rationally can't claim anything. It's not saying anything if there's nothing that it can be wrong about.
This is something which the gentleman from Turkey was saying. I am not offended by Christianity in the sense of Christian faith,
No.
but I really feel threatened by organized religion in the form of when something is said on behalf of the church, to be honest. I mean, with 900 years of...
When anything's said, or when particular things are said?
No, what I'm saying that would you, I mean, is it not fair to differentiate between religion, religious faith and organized religion? Otherwise, if we club together all these three different things in religion, we will be doing a terrible disservice to the differences which really do exist. I mean,
but if you're talking about organized religion,
yes.
to some extent, then we're talking about human institutions. Now, I mean, they may, in the religious context, be often seen as more than that, but they are human institutions, and to some extent, then, they're going to be operating in the field of, in a sense, power politics of one kind
Exactly.
or another, and with all the human frailties that involves.
Yes.
And that's what you're worried about, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean,
yes.
just to give you one concrete example, Pope, when visited India a couple of years ago, he said this millennium, it's their God-given duty or responsibility to save the Asians in this millennium. Now, this could be a wonderful opportunity to interfaith dialogue with Imam Bukhari or
Yeah.
Dalai Lama, but it didn't happen. And I was talking to the director of Oxford Center for Hindu Studies. By the way, he's a Christian, but he's deeply interested in Hindu studies. And he was telling me, look, there is a serious problem here because with the history of colonization and the imperialism, it's really very difficult for us to come out of the, the whales or the shells and to appreciate what could be true of other religion. And I think it's partly explains. I mean, we have learned to differentiate that Christianity and churchianity. What we find as Christianity is actually churchianity. I consider myself as a follower of Jesus Christ, but some of my Christian friends will be saying, no, you are not a follower of Jesus Christ because you do not belong to the church. But don't you think it's right or rational to, categorize and differentiate between religion, religious faith and organized religion, which is very socio-political institution?
Yes, I mean, but you've got to be very careful there, though, because if you discount organised religion completely, we might be back to individuals and to rather great subjectivism of just what different individuals operating in their own sphere. But I mean, certainly institutions are obviously open to all kinds of temptations to do with power. And I mean, it's the same from the Christian side. It's very easy to look at Islam and then confuse Islam with, say, the antics of the Iranian government.
Exactly.
And which wouldn't be fair either. I mean, that's exactly the same kind of thing. And you see Ayatollahs saying this and that, and they think, oh, that's the Muslims. All Muslims think like that. And it's the same kind of slide, isn't it? So I mean, I can see your worry, but I don't. I mean, on the other hand, I mean, there is a very deep problem here about preaching to other religions, isn't there? I mean, you're skirting that as well, which is a big issue we can talk about another time. Yes.
It is an important one because
Yes.
I mean, certainly for Christians and Muslims, it's incumbent to preach and to attempt to convert.
Yes, and again, I would say, well, reason enters into that I mean, you shouldn't be kind of putting pressure on people or using underhand methods, but actually telling them about things is perfectly reasonable. I'm to have no problem with ideas floating around, scriptures being offered and so on, but people are free to reject.
Yes. Well, now I think we'll. I'd love to take more. I think you were first.
Yes.
Okay, thank you for the talk. I was going to ask a non-literal reading of religious texts. Do you think that will prevent us from testing the rationality of them?
depends which texts, and I mean, what do you mean by literal? And I mean that's a big question. But I do understand what lies behind it. That there is a great temptation for some people to backtrack and reinterpret apparently clear claims to mean something else. So, for instance, one can reinterpret the resurrection of Jesus so that it's actually not what it isn't a claim about somebody actually rising from the dead. It has a meaning. And I do think sometimes there's a great problem with this kind of approach, that a lot of people want to keep the meaning of, say, a miracle or something like that while denying the miracle. It's a bit like the Cheshire Cat. You can have the smile without the cat. And I don't see how something can have a meaning if the thing isn't there anymore. But so I think there are great dangers in that approach. But I mean, I think you've got to look at, I mean, the one other danger is interpreting literally what was never intended to be literal. And so that's another issue.
Another massive problem.
Yes.
But I think we have to stop. I'm sorry. Write your question down, I think. And we'll come back to it in the panel later on. Because we do need just a little breather, I think, before dinner. But anyway,
right.
Thanks indeed, Rob.